Chapter 1b. The Impeccability of the Nagual Elias. I had no way of telling how long I slept in that cave. Don Juan's voice startled me, and I awoke. He was saying that the first sorcery story concerning the manifestations of the Spirit was an account of the relationship between intent and the nawal. It was the story of how the Spirit set up a lure for the nawal, a prospective disciple, and of how the nawal had to evaluate the lure before making his decision either to accept or reject it. It was very dark in the cave, and the small space was confining. Ordinarily, an area of that size would have made me claustrophobic, but the cave kept soothing me, dispelling my feelings of annoyance. Also, something in the configuration of the cave absorbed the echoes of Don Juan's words. Don Juan explained that every act performed by sorcerers, especially by the nawals, was either performed as a way to strengthen their link with intent or as a response triggered by the link itself. Sorcerers, and specifically the nawals, therefore had to be actively and permanently on the lookout for manifestations of the Spirit. Such manifestations were called gestures of the Spirit, or more simply, indications or omens. He repeated a story he had already told me, the story of how he had met his benefactor, the Nagual Julian. Don Juan had been cajoled by two crooked men to take a job on an isolated hacienda. One of the men, the foreman of the hacienda, simply took possession of Don Juan and in effect made him a slave. Desperate and with no other course of action, Don Juan escaped. The violent foreman chased him and caught him on a country road where he shot Don Juan in the chest and left him for dead. Don Juan was lying unconscious in the road, bleeding to death, when the Nagual Julian came along. Using his healer's knowledge, he stopped the bleeding, took Don Juan, who was still unconscious, home and cured him. The indications the Spirit gave the Nagual Julian about Don Juan were first a small cyclone that lifted a cone of dust on the road a couple of yards from where he lay. The second omen was the thought which had crossed the Nagual Julian's mind an instant before he had heard the report of the gun a few yards away, that it was time to have an apprentice nawal. Moments later, the Spirit gave him the third omen, when he ran to take cover and instead collided with the gunman, putting him to flight, perhaps preventing him from shooting Don Juan a second time. A collision with someone was the type of blunder which no sorcerer, much less a nawal, should ever make. The Nagual Julian immediately evaluated the opportunity. When he saw Don Juan, he understood the reason for the Spirit's manifestation. Here was a double man, a perfect candidate to be his apprentice nawal. This brought up a nagging rational concern for me. I wanted to know if sorcerers could interpret an omen erroneously. Don Juan replied that although my question sounded perfectly legitimate, it was inapplicable, like the majority of my questions, because I asked them based on my experiences in the world of everyday life. Thus, they were always about tested procedures, steps to be followed, and rules of meticulousness, but had nothing to do with the premises of sorcery. He pointed out that the flaw in my reasoning was that I always failed to include my experiences in the sorcerer's world. I argued that very few of my experiences in the sorcerer's world had continuity, and therefore I could not make use of those experiences in my present day-to-day life. Very few times, and only when I was in states of profound heightened awareness, had I remembered everything. At the level of heightened awareness I usually reached, the only experience that had continuity between past and present was that of knowing him. He responded cuttingly that I was perfectly capable of engaging in sorcerer's reasonings because I had experienced the sorcery premises in my normal state of awareness. In a more mellow tone, he added that heightened awareness did not reveal everything until the whole edifice of sorcery knowledge was completed. Then he answered my question about whether or not sorcerers could misinterpret omens. He explained that when a sorcerer interpreted an omen, he knew its exact meaning without having any notion of how he knew it. This was one of the bewildering effects of the connecting link with intent. Sorcerers had a sense of knowing things directly. How sure they were depended on the strength and clarity of their connecting link. He said that the feeling everyone knows as intuition is the activation of our link with intent. And since sorcerers deliberately pursue the understanding and strengthening of that link, it could be said that they intuit everything unerringly and accurately. Reading omens is commonplace for sorcerers. Mistakes happen only when personal feelings intervene and cloud the sorcerer's connecting link with intent. Otherwise, their direct knowledge is totally accurate and functional. We remained quiet for a while. All of a sudden he said, "I'm going to tell you a story about the Naguals Elias and the manifestation of the Spirit. The Spirit manifests itself to a sorcerer, especially to a Nawal, at every turn. However, this is not the entire truth. The entire truth is that the Spirit reveals itself to everyone with the same intensity and consistency, but only sorcerers, and Nawals in particular, are attuned to such revelations." Don Juan began his story. He said that the Naguals Elias had been riding his horse to the city one day, taking him through a shortcut by some cornfields, when suddenly his horse shied, frightened by the low, fast sweep of a falcon that missed the Nawal's straw hat by only a few inches. The Nawal immediately dismounted and began to look around. He saw a strange young man among the tall, dry cornstalks. The man was dressed in an expensive dark suit and appeared alien there. The Naguals Elias was used to the sight of peasants or landowners in the fields, but he had never seen an elegantly dressed city man moving through the fields with apparent disregard for his expensive shoes and clothes. The Nawal tethered his horse and walked toward the young man. He recognized the flight of the falcon, as well as the man's apparel, as obvious manifestations of the Spirit, which he could not disregard. He got very close to the young man and saw what was going on. The man was chasing a peasant woman who was running a few yards ahead of him, dodging and laughing with him. The contradiction was quite apparent to the nawal. The two people cavorting in the cornfield did not belong together. The nawal thought that the man must be the landowner's son, and the woman a servant in the house. He felt embarrassed to be observing them, and was about to turn and leave, when the falcon again swept over the cornfield, and this time brushed the young man's head. The falcon alarmed the couple, and they stopped and looked up, trying to anticipate another sweep. The nawal noticed that the man was thin and handsome, and had haunting, restless eyes. Then the couple became bored, watching for the falcon, and returned to their play. The man caught the woman, embraced her, and gently laid her on the ground. But instead of trying to make love to her, as the nawal assumed he would do next, he removed his own clothes and paraded naked in front of the woman. She did not shyly close her eyes or scream with embarrassment or fright. She giggled, mesmerized by the prancing naked man, who moved around her like a satyr, making lewd gestures and laughing. Finally, apparently overpowered by the sight, she uttered a wild cry, rose, and threw herself into the young man's arms. Don Juan said that the Naguals Elias confessed to him that the indications of the spirit on that occasion had been most baffling. It was clearly evident that the man was insane. Otherwise, knowing how protective peasants were of their women, he would not have considered seducing a young peasant woman in broad daylight a few yards from the road, and naked to boot. Don Juan broke into a laugh and told me that in those days to take off one's clothes and engage in a sexual act in broad daylight in such a place meant one had to be either insane or blessed by the spirit. He added that what the man had done might not seem remarkable nowadays, but then, nearly 100 years ago, people were infinitely more inhibited. All of this convinced the Naguals Elias from the moment he laid eyes on the man that he was both insane and blessed by the spirit. He worried that peasants might happen by, become enraged, and lynch the man on the spot, but no one did. It felt to the Nagual as if time had been suspended. When the man finished making love, he put on his clothes, took out a handkerchief, meticulously dusted his shoes, and all the while making wild promises to the girl, went on his way. The Naguals Elias followed him. In fact, he followed him for several days and found out that his name was Julian and that he was an actor. Subsequently, the Nagual saw him on the stage often, enough to realize that the actor had a great deal of charisma. The audience, especially the women, loved him, and he had no scruples about making use of his charismatic gifts to seduce female admirers. As the Nagual followed the actor, he was able to witness his seduction technique more than once. It entailed showing himself naked to his adoring fans as soon as he got them alone, then waiting until the women, stunned by his display, surrendered. The technique seemed extremely effective for him. The Nawal had to admit that the actor was a great success, except on one count. He was mortally ill. The Nawal had seen the black shadow of death that followed him everywhere. Don Juan explained again something he had told me years before, that our death was a black spot right behind the left shoulder. He said that sorcerers knew when a person was close to dying because they could see the dark spot, which became a moving shadow, the exact size and shape of the person to whom it belonged. As he recognized the imminent presence of death, the Nawal was plunged into a numbing perplexity. He wondered why the spirit was singling out such a sick person. He had been taught that in a natural state, replacement, not repair, prevailed. And the Nawal doubted that he had the ability or the strength to heal this young man, or resist the black shadow of his death. He even doubted if he would be able to discover why the spirit had involved him in a display of such obvious waste. The Nawal could do nothing but stay with the actor, follow him around, and wait for the opportunity to see in greater depth. Don Juan explained that a Nawal's first reaction upon being faced with the manifestation of the spirit is to see the persons involved. The Naguals Elias had been meticulous about seeing the man the moment he laid eyes on him. He had also seen the peasant woman who was part of the spirit's manifestation, but he had seen nothing that, in his judgment, could have warranted the spirit's display. In the course of witnessing another seduction, however, the Nawal's ability to see took on a new depth. This time, the actor's adoring fan was the daughter of a rich landowner, and from the start, she was in complete control. The Nawal found out about their rendezvous because he overheard her daring the actor to meet her the next day. The Nawal was hiding across the street at dawn when the young woman left her house, and instead of going to early mass, she went to join the actor. The actor was waiting for her, and she coaxed him into following her to the open fields. He appeared to hesitate, but she taunted him and would not allow him to withdraw. As the Nawal watched them sneaking away, he had an absolute conviction that something was going to happen on that day, which neither of the players was anticipating. He saw that the actor's black shadow had grown to almost twice his height. The Nawal deduced from the mysterious hard look in the young woman's eyes that she too had felt the black shadow of death at an intuitive level. The actor seemed preoccupied. He did not laugh as he had on other occasions. They walked quite a distance. At one point, they spotted the Nawal following them, but he instantly pretended to be working the land, a peasant who belonged there. That made the couple relax and allowed the Nawal to come closer. Then the moment came when the actor tossed off his clothes and showed himself to the girl. But instead of swooning and falling into his arms, as his other conquests had, This girl began to hit him. She kicked and punched him mercilessly and stepped on his bare toes, making him cry out with pain. The nawal knew the man had not threatened or harmed the young woman. He had not laid a finger on her. She was the only one fighting. He was merely trying to parry the blows, and persistently, but without enthusiasm, trying to entice her by showing her his genitals. The nawal was filled with both revulsion and admiration. He could perceive that the actor was an irredeemable libertine, but he could also perceive equally easily that there was something unique, although revolting, about him. It baffled the nawal to see that the man's connecting link with the spirit was extraordinarily clear. Finally, the attack ended. The woman stopped beating the actor. But then, instead of running away, she surrendered, lay down, and told the actor he could now have his way with her. The nawal observed that the man was so exhausted he was practically unconscious. Yet despite his fatigue, he went right ahead and consummated his seduction. The nawal was laughing and pondering that useless man's great stamina and determination when the woman screamed and the actor began to gasp. The nawal saw how the black shadow struck the actor. It went like a dagger, with pinpoint accuracy, into his gap. Don Juan made a digression at this point to elaborate on something he had explained before. He had described the gap, an opening in our luminous shell at the height of the navel, where the force of death ceaselessly struck. What Don Juan now explained was that when death hit healthy beings, it was with a ball-like blow, like the punch of a fist. But when beings were dying, death struck them with a dagger-like thrust. Thus, the Naguals Elias knew, without any question, that the actor was as good as dead, and his death automatically finished his own interest in the spirit's designs. There were no designs left. Death had leveled everything. He rose from his hiding place and started to leave, when something made him hesitate. It was the young woman's calmness. She was nonchalantly putting on the few pieces of clothing she had taken off, and was whistling tunelessly as if nothing had happened. And then the Nawal saw that in relaxing to accept the presence of death, the man's body had released a protecting veil and revealed his true nature. He was a double man of tremendous resources, capable of creating a screen for protection or disguise, a natural sorcerer, and a perfect candidate for a Nawal apprentice, had it not been for the black shadow of death. The Nawal was completely taken aback by that sight. He now understood the designs of the spirit, but failed to comprehend how such a useless man could fit in the sorcerer's scheme of things. The woman, in the meantime, had stood up, and without so much as a glance at the man, whose body was contorting with death spasms, walked away. The Nawal then saw her luminosity and realized that her extreme aggressiveness was the result of an enormous flow of superfluous energy. He became convinced that if she did not put that energy to sober use, it would get the best of her, and there was no telling what misfortunes it would cause her. As the nawal watched the unconcern with which she walked away, he realized that the spirit had given him another manifestation. He needed to be calm, nonchalant. He needed to act as if he had nothing to lose, and intervene for the hell of it. In true nawal fashion, he decided to tackle the impossible, with no one except the spirit as witness. Don Juan commented that it took incidents like this to test whether a nawal is the real thing or a fake. Nawals make decisions with no regard for the consequences. They take action or choose not to. Imposters ponder and become paralyzed. The Naguals Elias, having made his decision, walked calmly to the side of the dying man and did the first thing his body, not his mind, compelled him to do. He struck the man's assemblage point to cause him to enter into heightened awareness. He struck him frantically again and again until his assemblage point moved. Aided by the force of death itself, the Nawal's blow sent the man's assemblage point to a place where death no longer mattered, and there he stopped dying. By the time the actor was breathing again, the Nawal had become aware of the magnitude of his responsibility. If the man was to fend off the force of his death, it would be necessary for him to remain in deep, heightened awareness until death had been repelled. The man's advanced physical deterioration meant he could not be moved from the spot, or he would instantly die. The Nawal did the only thing possible under the circumstances. He built a shack around the body. There, for 3 months, he nursed the totally immobilized man. My rational thoughts took over, and instead of just listening, I wanted to know how the Naguals Elias could build a shack on someone else's land. I was aware of the rural people's passion about land ownership and its accompanying feelings of territoriality. Don Juan admitted that he had asked the same question himself, and the Naguals Elias had said that the spirit itself had made it possible. This was the case with everything a Nawal undertook, providing he followed the spirit's manifestations. The first thing the Naguals Elias did when the actor was breathing again was to run after the young woman. She was an important part of the spirit's manifestation. He caught up with her not too far from the spot where the actor lay barely alive. Rather than talking to her about the man's plight and trying to convince her to help him, he again assumed total responsibility for his actions and jumped on her like a lion, striking her assemblage point a mighty blow. Both she and the actor were capable of sustaining life or death blows. Her assemblage point moved, but began to shift erratically once it was loose. The Nawal carried the young woman to where the actor lay. Then he spent the entire day trying to keep her from losing her mind and the man from losing his life. When he was fairly certain he had a degree of control, he went to the woman's father and told him that lightning must have struck his daughter and made her temporarily mad. He took the father to where she lay and said that the young man, whoever he was, had taken the whole charge of the lightning with his body, thus saving the girl from certain death, but injuring himself to the point that he could not be moved. The grateful father helped the nawal build the shack for the man who had saved his daughter. And in 3 months, the nawal accomplished the impossible. He healed the young man. When the time came for the nawal to leave, his sense of responsibility and his duty required him both to warn the young woman about her excess energy and the injurious consequences it would have on her life and well-being, and to ask her to join the sorcerer's world, as that would be the only defense against her self-destructive strength. The woman did not respond, and the Nagual Elias was obliged to tell her what every Nagual has said to a prospective apprentice throughout the ages: that sorcerers speak of sorcery as a magical, mysterious bird which has paused in its flight for a moment in order to give man hope and purpose. That sorcerers live under the wing of that bird, which they call the bird of wisdom, the bird of freedom, that they nourish it with their dedication and impeccability. He told her that sorcerers knew the flight of the bird of freedom was always a straight line, since it had no way of making a loop, no way of circling back and returning, and that the bird of freedom could do only 2 things: take sorcerers along or leave them behind. The Nagual Elias could not talk to the young actor, who was still mortally ill in the same way. The young man did not have much of a choice. Still, the Nagual told him that if he wanted to be cured, he would have to follow the Nagual unconditionally. The actor accepted the terms instantly. The day the Nagual Elias and the actor started back home, the young woman was waiting silently at the edge of town. She carried no suitcases, not even a basket. She seemed to have come merely to see them off. The Nagual kept walking without looking at her, but the actor, being carried on a stretcher, strained to say goodbye to her. She laughed and wordlessly merged into the Nagual's party. She had no doubts and no problem about leaving everything behind. She had understood perfectly that there was no second chance for her, that the bird of freedom either took sorcerers along or left them behind. Don Juan commented that that was not surprising. The force of the Nagual's personality was always so overwhelming that he was practically irresistible, and the Nagual Elias had affected those 2 people deeply. He had had 3 months of daily interaction to accustom them to his consistency, his detachment, his objectivity. They had become enchanted by his sobriety, and above all, by his total dedication to them. Through his example and his actions, the Naguals Elias had given them a sustained view of the sorcerer's world, supportive and nurturing, yet utterly demanding. It was a world that admitted very few mistakes. Don Juan reminded me then of something he had repeated to me often, but which I had always managed not to think about. He said that I should not forget, even for an instant, that the bird of freedom had very little patience with indecision, and when it flew away, it never returned. The chilling resonance of his voice made the surroundings, which only a second before had been peacefully dark, burst with immediacy. Don Juan summoned the peaceful darkness back as fast as he had summoned urgency. He punched me lightly on the arm. That woman was so powerful that she could dance circles around anyone, he said. Her name was Talia. Chapter 2. The Knock of the Spirit. The Abstract. We returned to Don Juan's house in the early hours of the morning. It took us a long time to climb down the mountain, mainly because I was afraid of stumbling into a precipice in the dark, and Don Juan had to keep stopping to catch the breath he lost laughing at me. I was dead tired, but I could not fall asleep. Before noon, it began to rain. The sound of the heavy downpour on the tile roof, instead of making me feel drowsy, removed every trace of sleepiness. I got up and went to look for Don Juan. I found him dozing in a chair. The moment I approached him, he was wide awake. I said good morning. You seem to be having no trouble falling asleep, I commented. When you have been afraid or upset, don't lie down to sleep, he said without looking at me. Sleep sitting up on a soft chair, as I'm doing. He had suggested once that if I wanted to give my body healing rest, I should take long naps, lying on my stomach with my face turned to the left and my feet over the foot of the bed. In order to avoid being cold, he recommended I put a soft pillow over my shoulder, away from my neck, and wear heavy socks, or just leave my shoes on. When I first heard his suggestion, I thought he was being funny, but later changed my mind. Sleeping in that position helped me rest extraordinarily well. When I commented on the surprising results, he advised that I follow his suggestions to the letter, without bothering to believe or disbelieve him. I suggested to Don Juan that he might have told me the night before about the sleeping in a sitting position. I explained to him that the cause of my sleeplessness, besides my extreme fatigue, was a strange concern about what he had told me in the sorcerer's cave. Cut it out, he explained. You've seen and heard infinitely more distressing things without losing a moment's sleep. Something else is bothering you. For a moment I thought he meant I was not being truthful with him about my real preoccupation. I began to explain, but he kept talking, as if I had not spoken. You stated categorically last night that the cave didn't make you feel ill at ease, he said. Well, it obviously did. Last night I didn't pursue the subject of the cave any further because I was waiting to observe your reaction. Don Juan explained that the cave had been designed by sorcerers in ancient times to serve as a catalyst. Its shape had been carefully constructed to accommodate two people as two fields of energy. The theory of the sorcerers was that the nature of the rock and the manner in which it had been carved allowed the two bodies, the two luminous balls, to intertwine their energy. I took you to that cave on purpose, he continued. Not because I like the place, I don't, but because it was created as an instrument to push the apprentice deep into heightened awareness. But unfortunately, as it helps, it also obscures issues. The ancient sorcerers were not given to thought. They leaned toward action. You always say that your benefactor was like that, I said. That's my own exaggeration, he answered. Very much like when I say you're a fool. My benefactor was a modern nawal, involved in the pursuit of freedom. But he leaned toward action instead of thoughts. You're a modern nawal, involved in the same quest, but you lean heavily toward the aberrations of reason. He must have thought his comparison was very funny. His laughter echoed in the empty room. When I brought the conversation back to the subject of the cave, he pretended not to hear me. I knew he was pretending because of the glint in his eyes and the way he smiled. Last night, I deliberately told you the first abstract core, he said, in the hope that by reflecting on the way I have acted with you over the years, you'll get an idea about the other cores. You've been with me for a long time, so you know me very well. During every minute of our association, I have tried to adjust my actions and thoughts to the patterns of the abstract cores. The Naguals Elias' story is another matter. Although it seems to be a story about people, it is really a story about intent. Intent creates edifices before us and invites us to enter them. This is the way sorcerers understand what is happening around them. Don Juan reminded me that I had always insisted on trying to discover the underlying order in everything, he said to me. I thought he was criticizing me for my attempt to turn whatever he was teaching me into a social science problem. I began to tell him that my outlook had changed under his influence. He stopped me and smiled. You really don't think too well, he said, and sighed. I want you to understand the underlying order of what I teach you. My objection is to what you think is the underlying order. To you, it means secret procedures or a hidden consistency. To me, it means two things. Both the edifice that intent manufactures in the blink of an eye and places in front of us to enter, and the signs it gives us so we won't get lost once we are inside. As you can see, the story of the Naguals Elias was more than merely an account of the sequential details that made up the event. he went on. Underneath all that was the edifice of intent. And the story was meant to give you an idea of what the nawals of the past were like, so that you would recognize how they acted in order to adjust their thoughts and actions to the edifices of intent. There was a prolonged silence. I did not have anything to say. Rather than let the conversation die, I said the first thing that came into my mind. I said that from the stories I had heard about the Naguals Elias, I had formed a very positive opinion of him. I liked the Naguals Elias, but for unknown reasons, everything Don Juan had told me about the Nagual Julian bothered me. The mere mention of my discomfort delighted Don Juan beyond measure. He had to stand up from his chair, lest he choke on his laughter. He put his arm on my shoulder and said that we either loved or hated those who were reflections of ourselves. Again, a silly self-consciousness prevented me from asking him what he meant. Don Juan kept on laughing, obviously aware of my mood. He finally commented that the Nagual Julian was like a child whose sobriety and moderation came always from without. He had no inner discipline beyond his training as an apprentice in sorcery. I had an irrational urge to defend myself. I told Don Juan that my discipline came from within me. Of course, he said patronizingly. You just can't expect to be exactly like him, and began to laugh again. Sometimes Don Juan exasperated me so that I was ready to yell. But my mood did not last. It dissipated so rapidly that another concern began to loom. I asked Don Juan if it was possible that I had entered into heightened awareness without being conscious of it. Or maybe I had remained in it for days. At this stage, you enter into heightened awareness all by yourself, he said. Heightened awareness is a mystery only for our reason. In practice, it's very simple. As with everything else, we complicate matters by trying to make the immensity that surrounds us reasonable. He remarked that I should be thinking about the abstract core he had given me, instead of arguing uselessly about my person. I told him that I had been thinking about it all morning and had come to realize that the metaphorical theme of the story was the manifestations of the Spirit. What I could not discern, however, was the abstract core he was talking about. It had to be something unstated. I repeat, he said, as if he were a schoolteacher drilling his students. The manifestations of the Spirit is the name for the first abstract core in the sorcery stories. Obviously, what sorcerers recognize as an abstract core is something that bypasses you at this moment. That part which escapes you, sorcerers know as the edifice of intent, or the silent voice of the Spirit, or the ulterior arrangement of the abstract. I said I understood ulterior to mean something not overtly revealed, as in ulterior motive. And he replied that in this case, ulterior meant more. It meant knowledge without words. outside our immediate comprehension, especially mine. He allowed that the comprehension he was referring to was merely beyond my aptitudes of the moment, not beyond my ultimate possibilities for understanding. If the abstract cores are beyond my comprehension, what's the point of talking about them? I asked. The rule says that the abstract cores and the sorcery stories must be told at this point, he replied. And someday the ulterior arrangement of the abstract, which is knowledge without words, or the edifice of intent inherent in the stories, will be revealed to you by the stories themselves. I still did not understand. The ulterior arrangement of the abstract is not merely the order in which the abstract cores were presented to you, he explained, or what they have in common either, nor even the web that joins them. Rather, it's to know the abstract directly, without the intervention of language. He scrutinized me in silence, from head to toe, with the obvious purpose of seeing me. It's not evident to you yet, he declared. He made a gesture of impatience, even short temper, as though he were annoyed at my slowness, and that worried me. Don Juan was not given to expressions of psychological displeasure. It has nothing to do with you or your actions, he said when I asked if he was angry or disappointed with me. It was a thought that crossed my mind the moment I saw you. There is a feature in your luminous being that the old sorcerers would have given anything to have. Tell me what it is, I demanded. I'll remind you of this some other time, he said. Meanwhile, let's continue with the element that propels us, the abstract. The element without which there could be no warrior's path, nor any warriors in search of knowledge. He said that the difficulties I was experiencing were nothing new to him. He himself had gone through agonies in order to understand the ulterior order of the abstract. And had it not been for the helping hand of the Naguals Elias, he would have wound up just like his benefactor, all action and very little understanding. What was the Naguals Elias like? I asked, to change the subject. He was not like his disciple at all, Don Juan said. He was an Indian, very dark and massive. He had rough features, big mouth, strong nose, small black eyes, thick black hair with no gray in it. He was shorter than the Nagual Julian and had big hands and feet. He was very humble and very wise, but he had no flair. Compared with my benefactor, he was dull. Always all by himself, pondering questions. The Nagual Julian used to joke that his teacher imparted wisdom by the ton. Behind his back, he used to call him the Nagual Tonnage. I never saw the reason for his jokes, Don Juan went on. To me, the Naguals Elias was like a breath of fresh air. He would patiently explain everything to me, very much as I explain things to you, but perhaps with a bit more of something. I wouldn't call it compassion, but rather empathy, Warriors are incapable of feeling compassion because they no longer feel sorry for themselves. Without the driving force of self-pity, compassion is meaningless. Are you saying, Don Juan, that a warrior is all for himself? In a way, yes. For a warrior, everything begins and ends with himself. However, his contact with the abstract causes him to overcome his feeling of self-importance. Then the self becomes abstract and impersonal. The Nagual Elias felt that our lives and our personalities were quite similar. Don Juan continued. For this reason, he felt obliged to help me. I don't feel that similarity with you, so I suppose I regard you very much the way the Nagual Julian used to regard me. Don Juan said that the Nagual Elias took him under his wing from the very first day he arrived at his benefactor's house to start his apprenticeship, and began to explain what was taking place in his training, regardless of whether Don Juan was capable of understanding. His urge to help Don Juan was so intense that he practically held him prisoner. He protected him in this manner from the Nagual Julian's harsh onslaughts. At the beginning, I used to stay at the Nagual Elias's house all the time, Don Juan continued, and I loved it. In my benefactor's house, I was always on the lookout, on guard, afraid of what he was going to do to me next. But in the Nagual Elias's home, I felt confident, at ease. My benefactor used to press me mercilessly, and I couldn't figure out why he was pressuring me so hard. I thought that the man was playing crazy. Don Juan said that the Nagual Elias was an Indian from the state of Oaxaca, who had been taught by another Nagual named Rosendo, who came from the same area. Don Juan described the Nagual Elias as being a very conservative man who cherished his privacy. And yet, he was a famous healer and sorcerer, not only in Oaxaca, but in all of southern Mexico. Nonetheless, in spite of his occupation and notoriety, he lived in complete isolation at the opposite end of the country, in northern Mexico. Don Juan stopped talking. Raising his eyebrows, he fixed me with a questioning look. But all I wanted was for him to continue his story. Every single time I think you should ask a question, you don't, he said. I'm sure you heard me say that the Nagual Elias was a famous sorcerer who dealt with people daily in southern Mexico, and at the same time he was a hermit in northern Mexico. Doesn't that arouse your curiosity? I felt abysmally stupid. I told him that the thought had crossed my mind as he was telling me those facts, that the man must have had terrible difficulty commuting. Don Juan laughed, and since he had made me aware of the question, I asked how it had been possible for the Nagual Elias to be in two places at once. Dreaming is a sorcerer's jet plane, he said. The Nagual Elias was a dreamer, as my benefactor was a stalker. He was able to create and project what sorcerers know as the dreaming body, or the other, and be in two distant places at the same time. With his dreaming body, he could carry on his business as a sorcerer, and with his natural self, be a recluse. I remarked that it amazed me that I could accept so easily the premise that the Nagual Elias had the ability to project a solid three-dimensional image of himself, and yet could not for the life of me understand the explanations about the abstract cores. Don Juan said that I could accept the idea of the Nagual Elias's dual life because the spirit was making final adjustments in my capacity for awareness. And I exploded into a barrage of protests at the obscurity of his statement. "It isn't obscure," he said. "It's a statement of fact. You could say that it's an incomprehensible fact for the moment, but the moment will change." Before I could reply, he began to talk again about the Nagual Elias. He said that the Nagual Elias had a very inquisitive mind and could work well with his hands. In his journeys as a dreamer, he saw many objects, which he copied in wood and forged iron. Don Juan assured me that some of those models were of a haunting, exquisite beauty. "What kind of objects were the originals?" I asked. "There's no way of knowing," Don Juan said. "You've got to consider that because he was an Indian, the Nagual Elias went into his dreaming journeys the way a wild animal prowls for food. An animal never shows up at a site when there are signs of activity. He comes only when no one is around. The Nagual Elias, as a solitary dreamer, visited, let's say, the junkyard of infinity when no one was around, and copied whatever he saw. But he never knew what those things were used for, or their source." Again, I had no trouble accepting what he was saying. The idea did not appear to me far-fetched in any way. I was about to comment when he interrupted me with a gesture of his eyebrows. He then continued his account about the Nagual Elias. "Visiting him was for me the ultimate treat," he said, "and simultaneously a source of strange guilt. I used to get bored to death there. Not because the Nagual Elias was boring, but because the Nagual Julian had no peers, and he spoiled anyone for life." "But I thought you were confident and at ease in the Nagual Elias's house," I said. "I was, and that was the source of my guilt and my imagined problem. Like you, I loved to torment myself. I think at the very beginning I found peace in the Nagual Elias's company. But later on, when I understood the Nagual Julian better, I went his way." He told me that the Nagual Elias's house had an open, roofed section in the front, where he had a forge and a carpentry bench and tools. The tiled roof adobe house consisted of a huge room with a dirt floor, where he lived with 5 women seers, who were actually his wives. There were also 4 men, sorcerer seers of his party, who lived in small houses around the Nagual's house. They were all Indians from different parts of the country who had migrated to northern Mexico. The Nagual Elias had great respect for sexual energy, Don Juan said. He believed it has been given to us so we can use it in dreaming. He believed dreaming had fallen into disuse because it can upset the precarious mental balance of susceptible people. I've taught you dreaming the same way he taught me, he continued. He taught me that while we dream, the assemblage point moves very gently and naturally. Mental balance is nothing but the fixing of the assemblage point on one spot we're accustomed to. If dreams make that point move, and dreaming is used to control that natural movement, and sexual energy is needed for dreaming, the result is sometimes disastrous when sexual energy is dissipated in sex instead of dreaming. Then dreamers move their assemblage point erratically and lose their minds. What are you trying to tell me, Don Juan? I asked, because I felt that the subject of dreaming had not been a natural drift in the conversation. You are a dreamer, he said. If you're not careful with your sexual energy, you might as well get used to the idea of erratic shifts of your assemblage point. A moment ago, you were bewildered by your reactions. Well, your assemblage point moves almost erratically because your sexual energy is not in balance. I made a stupid and an inappropriate comment about the sex life of adult males. Our sexual energy is what governs dreaming, he explained. The Nagual Elias taught me, and I taught you, that you either make love with your sexual energy or you dream with it. There is no other way. The reason I mention it at all is because you are having great difficulty shifting your assemblage point to grasp our last topic, the abstract. The same thing happened to me, Don Juan went on. It was only when my sexual energy was freed from the world that everything fit into place. That is the rule for dreamers. Stalkers are the opposite. My benefactor was, you could say, a sexual libertine, both as an average man and as a nawal. Don Juan seemed to be on the verge of revealing his benefactor's doings, but he obviously changed his mind. He shook his head and said that I was way too stiff for such revelations. I did not insist. He said that the Nagual Elias had the sobriety that only dreamers acquired after inconceivable battles with themselves. He used his sobriety to plunge himself into the task of answering Don Juan's questions. The Nagual Elias explained that my difficulty in understanding the spirit was the same as his own. Don Juan continued. He thought there were two different issues. One, the need to understand indirectly what the spirit is, and the other, to understand the spirit directly. You're having problems with the first. Once you understand what the spirit is, the second issue will be resolved automatically, and vice versa. If the spirit speaks to you using its silent words, you will certainly know immediately what the spirit is. He said that the Nagual Elias believed that the difficulty was our reluctance to accept the idea that knowledge could exist without words to explain it. But I have no difficulty accepting that, I said. Accepting this proposition is not as easy as it's saying you accept it, Don Juan said. The Naguals Elias used to tell me that the whole of humanity has moved away from the abstract, although at one time we must have been close to it. It must have been our sustaining force. And then something happened and pulled us away from the abstract. Now we can't get back to it. He used to say that it takes years for an apprentice to be able to go back to the abstract. That is, to know that knowledge and language can exist independent of each other. Don Juan repeated that the crux of our difficulty in going back to the abstract was our refusal to accept that we could know without words, or even without thoughts. I was going to argue that he was talking nonsense when I got the strong feeling I was missing something, and that his point was of crucial importance to me. He was really trying to tell me something I could not grasp or which could not be told completely. Knowledge and language are separate, he repeated softly. And I was just about to say, I know it, as if indeed I knew it, when I caught myself. I told you there is no way to talk about the spirit, he continued, because the spirit can only be experienced. Sorcerers try to explain this condition when they say that the spirit is nothing you can see or feel, but it's there, looming over us always. Sometimes it comes to some of us. Most of the time, it seems indifferent. I kept quiet, and he continued to explain. He said that the spirit in many ways was a sort of wild animal. It kept its distance from us until a moment when something enticed it forward. It was then that the spirit manifested itself. I raised the point that if the spirit wasn't an entity or a presence and had no essence, how could anyone entice it? Your problem, he said, is that you consider only your own idea of what's abstract. For instance, the inner essence of man, or the fundamental principle, are abstracts for you. Or perhaps something a bit less vague, such as character, volition, courage, dignity, honor. The spirit, of course, can be described in terms of all of these. And that's what's so confusing, that it's all these and none of them. He added that what I considered abstractions were either the opposites of all the practicalities I could think of, or things I had decided did not have concrete existence. Whereas for a sorcerer, an abstract is something with no parallel in the human condition, he said. But they're the same thing, I shouted. Don't you see that we're both talking about the same thing? We are not, he insisted. For a sorcerer, the spirit is an abstract simply because he knows it without words or even thoughts. It's an abstract because he can't conceive what the spirit is. Yet, without the slightest chance or desire to understand it, a sorcerer handles the spirit. He recognizes it, beckons it, entices it, becomes familiar with it, and expresses it with his acts. I shook my head in despair. I could not see the difference. The root of your misconception is that I have used the term abstract to describe the spirit, he said. For you, abstracts are words which describe states of intuition. An example is the word spirit, which doesn't describe reason or pragmatic experience, and which, of course, is of no use to you other than to tickle your fancy. I was furious with Don Juan. I called him obstinate, and he laughed at me. He suggested that if I would think about the proposition that knowledge might be independent of language, without bothering to understand it, perhaps I could see the light. Consider this, he said. It was not the act of meeting me that mattered to you. The day I met you, you met the abstract. But since you couldn't talk about it, you didn't notice it. Sorcerers meet the abstract without thinking about it, or seeing it, or touching it, or feeling its presence. I remained quiet because I did not enjoy arguing with him. At times I considered him to be quite willfully abstruse. But Don Juan seemed to be enjoying himself immensely.